speaking with Nischa Phair. She's an author, a researcher, and a trauma-informed sex educator. She's written a new book called Fawn, and today we're going to be hearing about how fawning comes up in our behaviors, in our relationships, in our sexual encounters, and how it can be very detrimental to our safety and our pleasure. So enjoy. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast for this week. This week, we're actually talking about a subject that I don't even know the meaning of. And it's not very often that I come across a term that I'm like, wow, I am completely unfamiliar with that. But my special guest this week is Nischa Phair. Hi, Nischa. How are you?
Hi. Thank you so much for having me, Natalie. It's great to be here.
So glad to have you here. Now, Nischa is a trauma-informed sex educator. So that in itself is like, wow, I've never even heard those words all put together at the same time either. And you have a new book that's come out that's called Fawn. And Fawn as in when no looks like yes. And we're talking about fawning in relationship to sexuality and you know, and sex and so forth and consensual sex. So why don't we start initially with a little bit of your story, because I think that this is some of your personal story is part of the motivation to, you know, to get this message out into the world.
Yeah. You know, I ended an abusive relationship about, when was it, 2014? And I spent about 2 years healing from that relationship. And I did all my personal work. And I should say I'm a trauma survivor. I have a lot of developmental trauma. I've also had assaults as an adult. So this sort of milieu of dangerous or unhealthy sexual interactions is something I have a lot of, you know, direct experience and knowledge about. And yet this piece of fawning was something that eluded me for a long time. So after I ended my relationship, when I was re-entering the dating space, my first experience back into, you know, going out on a date with a guy, all I wanted, and I said this to him, you know, we had a conversation about this. All I wanted was to like make out like horny teenagers, you know, like have one of those like hot summer, sweaty, fun, you know, little interactions. And in the middle of our making out, he was 6'5". And he literally caged my body with his and just snarled at me that we were going to have sex and just didn't have a conversation about it, didn't ask me. And now I want to say, I don't believe he had any intentions of raping me. I don't believe that that was, you know, what his desire or design of his behavior was. But I think, you know, that's part of how men are conditioned. So that's a bit of an aside. Anyways, in that moment, I completely froze. I couldn't talk. I felt completely contracted in my body. All of the feelings of sexual empowerment and autonomy that I had, all the ability to like communicate what I liked and what I wanted, gone out the window. And the interaction went on, and I ended up giving him what I call the get out of my apartment hand job, just to get the whole thing over with. And about 2 weeks later, it took time, all of these feelings of disgust and anger and like deep, deep grief started to just well up in me. And I started having all these flashbacks of every single other time this had happened to me in a sexual interaction, whether it was with a partner, like a long-term partner in my marriage, or, you know, in a short-term or casual interaction. And at that time, so I've been an embodiment coach for about 14 years now, and I knew about fawning in the context of, say, authoritarian parent-child relationships or relationships where there's a parent who might be emotionally unavailable and the child fawns or sacrifices his or her own authenticity as a way to try and get attention and meet the parent's needs as a way to gain love and affection. But I hadn't explored the way it shows up in our intimate interaction. So that bit of a long backstory, but that is sort of the the event that started me on this journey to better understand how prevalent is this? What are all the different kind of, forces, implications, and factors that create it and perpetuate it? And how can we, A, stop it from happening, and B, begin to heal ourselves after having had relationships where this fawning element was playing a role?
Right. And so the definition of fawning is what, changing your behavior to please the other person?
So
in essence,
fawning is one of our stress responses. It's a natural biological stress response. All humans have the capacity for it. Mammals even do it. So, our nervous systems are mammalian. They're not uniquely human. We've been evolving all of these stress responses over millions of years. So it's a stress response that is biological for all people, but because of the neuroendocrine, mineral and physiological profile of women, we are biologically predisposed to use this stress response in times of overwhelm.
Right.
The thing about fawn is that it's a hierarchical stress response. So it's uniquely social. It's, you don't fawn at a falling tree branch or a scary movie, right? We fawn with other people, whether it's like, a superior at work or within an intimate relationship, or, in cases of, racism and misogyny that we encounter in our society day to day. So biological, it's socially conditioned as part of how we understand femininity and gender. So the story that we create about female sexuality, about what it needs to be and look like, and then the expectations that other people have about how we perform our sexuality. Fawn is a really big part of, or those behaviors are a really big part of our social conditioning. And then you have the upbringing piece. So it's really happening on three levels: the bio, psychosocial, and the social. Bio and psychosocial. Mm-hmm. And the one thing I think that really hits home for people is when, so all of the behaviors that we trip over in our relationships, things like losing yourself to a relationship, self-abandoning, going along with things you don't really want to do, silencing yourself, deprioritizing your needs, maybe agreeing to a certain sexual act in order to try and save the relationship. All of these incidences or experiences, they're not flaws. They're not things we do because we're bad at relationships. They are symptoms of fawn responses happening within our intimate interactions.
Right. And it sounds like some of those fawning activities or, behaviors are, eventually they're not great, but some of them have bigger consequences than others by the sounds of things.
Big time. Yeah. The fawn response is really rooted in what's called the tend befriend response. And this is it was actually only found in 2000. So the other thing about fawning and tending and befriending and the idea of there being a unique set of stress responses that are primarily female is so new. We only found out about this in 2000. And the word fawn was only brought into our lexicon in 2013. So we're really at the forefront of trying to understand all of this information, how it fits into our experience as women, our experiences in relationships. And it can be something where you have to dish out a get out of my apartment hand job, but it can also have more injurious effects where someone actually assaults you, right? Mm-hmm. And the piece about with that get out of my apartment hand job, that wasn't my choice. I didn't want to do that. I wasn't excited about it. It took all the joy out of giving pleasure to someone, which I really enjoy doing. Giving pleasure is pleasurable, right? Mm. So it's a stress response that causes us to abandon ourselves and to abandon our own authenticity, what might be authentically true for us in a moment. So that has, like you say, really low end ramifications and some really big ones, because it can make us stay in abusive relationships. right? It can make us go along with criminal things we don't want to do because we're trying to maintain our own safety. It's not a choice. It's not something we do because we're bad or we're superficial or we don't have a backbone. We're doing it to survive.
Right. Or sometimes we're doing it unknowingly. I know that. Yeah. Like I was married for 20 years, and towards the end, I realized, after we'd separated, I realized, wow, I changed so much to be with Glenn, like to be with my husband. And it got to the point when I was, 20 years later, I'm like, I can't do this anymore, but I hadn't realized how much that had evolved and changed over the years. And I think you're right. Like as women, we do. I mean, when I first met Glenn, I was 25. So in your 20s, you're still trying to figure out who you are. So, and of course, I mean, believe me, as you know, I still have a business relationship with Glenn. We're still friends. We had an amazing marriage until I personally couldn't keep up with I don't feel like I'm being myself. This doesn't feel real. Like there's so many things I want to say that I just can't say. And so that it kind of ended in the end of the marriage. But that seems to be a pretty common occurrence for most women.
Big time. Yeah. I mean, the thing about when you really go down the rabbit hole of fawning, it can be a bit of a, do you swear on this podcast?
You can.
Mindfuck.
Right.
It can really be a bit of a mindfuck because what happens when the stress response is triggered, all of the blood flow from your language center and the parts of your brain that are responsible for initiating speech moves out of those parts of the brain into your stress organs, like the amygdala, and the my gosh, my brain is going right now. The amygdala and the hippocampus, and into your heart and your lungs and all the primary organs that we need for survival. So if you don't have blood flow, if you don't have access to those language centers, parts of your brain that are responsible for making speech, you can't use your voice in the moment. So whether that's happening in a sexual encounter, whether it's happening while you're making dinner, or whether it's happening in the car, it's a biological suppression of our voice. And our voice is the first reflex we have for speaking our truth. And now over time, when we see that happening over the course of a relationship, long-term, we see people being less likely to use their voice or language at all. So, writers may become less likely to use their creative abilities in writing if they're constantly having to use these stress responses that are inhibiting their ability to make language, right? So these are there's a real lived experience, behavioral piece, but it's being supported by all of these biological functions that are literally, in some cases, making it feel like we're living in a cast, right? Where it's like we're so cut off from who we are, and getting to break through the cast can be challenging. But the example that you said in your own life, there comes a point where you just realize how far away you are from who you are. And the only way through is like that Kool-Aid man through the wall.
Yes. Well, and for me, I really didn't have the insight until we'd separated and I started stepping into this, first I was thinking, oh my God, who am I without him? It's been Glenn and Nat for 20 years. Like it's, you're trying to wrap your head around that. And then it was the whole, who do I want to be? And I get to redesign myself. But what happened is I ended up I thought I was Nat 2.0. I thought I was the new improved version. But a friend of mine said, no, you're original Nat. So I'd actually taken off all the layers and everything that wasn't authentically me and got back to that version of me that truly is me. I'm like, oh, I've missed you. Like, I remember you. But it took me a while to do that. So if someone is in a relationship or is in a situation where they feel like that, you're listening to this podcast, you go, oh, I identify myself in a lot of this. I mean, are there red flags that they can look for? And what do you do when you realize that this is, this has been part of your behavior?
Yeah. So another thing that this fawn response does is it inhibits our awareness, which is it's like our bodies are just like sabotaging us at every point, but it is really designed ultimately to support our survival, which in some cases, if someone's in a really unhealthy relationship, that's actually helping them to survive. So I think everyone's different. Every case is different. I mean, if someone's in like that, an abusive relationship, you really have to do the best with what you have. And sometimes even having this awakening of like, oh my gosh, this is me, this is happening, has to be approached with really tender baby steps because it's a high risk situation. So it's more of a disclaimer than anything else, because every case really is different. I think that the most important part is acknowledging that this might be something that you're doing. And then in terms of the work that I do with clients, I go straight to the body and what the body's doing. So once folks find me and they say, okay, well, I'm totally doing this, how do I stop? Instead of, sending people home with all of these instructions and you have to do this, my approach is to slow down and come into a place of really like gentle, loving awareness of yourself. So the next time you fawn, what do you notice in your body? Where do you feel that? Do you feel contracted in your heart? Do you feel like your stomach's in knots? Do you feel like your energy is shrunk down and you're kind of cowering away from the person that you're with? Really coming to terms with the fact that our physiology, our bodies, it's not just, who we are in our heads, that our bodies are really supporting us and perpetuating these responses is a really important step to stopping them. Yeah. Because there's always little tiny red flags that happen before the fawning happens. There might be a feeling of, some people get a feeling of like a buzzing in their skin. You might get a little flash of adrenaline, right? So coming to the body first and looking for those cues and cultivating awareness in that way is how we stop it, right? Because it's like anything with where our conditioning is concerned, like words go like in one ear, out the other. We have to come to where the conditioning lives, which is in our tissues.
Right. Wow. I know it's such a biological reaction as well, right? Yeah. It's not like we, like you said, it's not like we consciously, are doing this, but we find ourselves just changing our behavior to help us in our situation. And yes, there are sometimes when this happens when it's very traumatic, and then other times when it's just part of who we are, and I think as women, we do try to, change a little to be in our relationships. I think we do try to appease our bosses and our partners and so forth. And so, for me, I look at that and go, okay, because I could recognize how I did that in the past. And I've been very, with my new relationship, I'm all about, I really want to be myself. Like I want to show up as myself and be unapologetic for that. But I think it's important that we do that, because otherwise you don't have a healthy relationship. It needs to be two whole people that are coming together, creating this third entity, in my opinion. But, and we actually met during the pandemic. So that was, it was interesting. So I'm sure that the pandemic has really changed a lot, because I know when we first, got together, it was like, our first date was a walk, because, that's what you do. And then there was all this, when we eventually were intimate with each other, it was like, oh, okay, how do we do this? Like, because you've got this whole COVID thing on top, you're like, oh, how do we, it's a whole new level of how do we be safe? But gratefully, we both have had a good connection. We were able to have a conversation, and we're on the same page. But I'm sure the pandemic has really changed a lot when it comes to these kind of things.
It has. And I'm actually of the opinion that it's made things better and will ultimately, in the long term, be supportive for the nurturing and nourishment of healthy relationship. We're having conversations that we never had before, or maybe didn't have for 1 or 2 years into a relationship until we were living together. And it's like, oh, dang, I'm living with someone who has completely different views than me, right? So we're getting all these tough conversations out earlier, out of the way. We're, like you say, we're starting with like a little walk. We're adopting more of the tenets of the slow dating movement, which I am like here for.
Right.
Just by virtue of the fact that we have this sort of threat that is kind of giving us all a little bit of cootie vibes, so we have to be quiet, be a little bit more discerning about how we approach and like that, having conversations. I think we're talking about sex and consent more, and getting a little bit more honest with ourselves about what our needs are. So I'm all for the changes that the pandemic has made for relationships. I mean, my big kind of, goal with this book and with my work currently is to dismantle toxic dating culture. And while we still have a long way to go, there are a lot of aspects of the way the pandemic is forcing us to get really real with one another and ourselves that I think will ultimately be to our benefit. I mean, the reality is crisis forces us to get really real about what matters to us. Right. And it forces us to look at where we're going. What are we doing? Like, if I continue down this path, where am I going to end up? So I see, obviously it's been very difficult for a lot of people, and it's been a huge, huge trauma to our way of life. But I ultimately think it's going to be, it's going to bring us to more authentic and more integrated experiences of intimacy with one another.
So I want to just, pull at that little thread that you dropped there about toxic dating culture. So, what, let's go there.
Yeah.
So what are some of the toxic things that come out of the dating culture that we need to address?
Sure. So, I mean, it's interesting. I think I see Twitter or Tinder, all these like swipey dating apps. They, for me, are kind of like, and I hate to bring politics into it, but are what Donald Trump was to racism, Tinder is to rape culture and toxic dating. It was always there. It was always festering underneath the surface, but it just made it easier to see. And it created more opportunities for it to emerge and happen for people. Right. So since Me Too, we were seeing a lot of people talking about, benching, breadcrumbing, stealthing, which is when a guy is wearing a condom and then takes it off right before he ejaculates into his partner. The thing that's really, really scaring me right now is that there's this new trend of non-consensual choking that a lot of people are experiencing. And so there are a lot of behaviors that have either been seen in, say, 50 Shades of Grey, or things people are seeing on pornography, or things that are being normalized by the healthy dispelling of shame, which is being done in, the sex education, pleasure education space, which again is necessary dispelling of shame. But when we don't have the consent process portrayed as in, say, the likes of 50 Shades of Grey, where you don't have a healthy relationship, you don't have two people sitting down saying, okay, so this is my safe word. This is how far I want to go. This is, I don't want you to choke me over top of my windpipe, or, having this conversation. Instead, people are just going hell for leather. And unfortunately, the realities of the way our sociosexual scripts, the kind of narratives we have about sexuality, particularly between men and women, women are accessories to a man's sexuality. They are the bodies that are used for men to be able to live out their fantasies and prove themselves worthy as a man. Right. So my big message is that we need to bring more compassion into dating, whether it's casual, one-on-one, don't know the name of my partner, never going to remember it. There still has to be compassion, acknowledgement for the fact that we're both human beings and we both have our own right to autonomy and pleasure, because that's the piece that's really being missed, is this idea of mutually beneficial sexual encounters, whether they're, happening for a night or a lifetime.
Right. So it sounds like the counter to fawning is to have the courage to have a conversation. Like before, like when you're in a situation or, if you're in a relationship, is actually sitting down and having the conversation. And I think the precursor to that is knowing what it is that you want. Like knowing, like if you want to have an equally pleasurable encounter with a man sexually, then you have to know what pleasure is for you. You have to be able to communicate that by the sounds of things. Like, that to me, I think is, I find it interesting how a lot of women find it really difficult to have those conversations. Yeah.
Well, we're not cultured to do it. Sex is so repressed. And particularly if you're raised in a religious community or had a religious upbringing, then your body was gross and disgusting and not to be touched. And if you're a woman, your body is only to be touched by a man, right? Like you're not supposed to engage with your own pleasure, enjoy your own body. So that's part of it. Right. But the other piece of being responsible for your pleasure that I really try to get home for people is that it's not just about knowing what you like, knowing what turns you on, knowing like what parts of your genitals are more sensitive than others. The big part of being responsible for your pleasure is knowing what characteristics in other people are going to prevent you from experiencing pleasure, because our potential for pleasure is not about how many orgasms we can have or how many times a week we have sex. It's about how much displeasure we allow into our lives, into our relationships, and into our beds. So I use one of my big slogans is your orgasm starts at hello. It doesn't start when your clothes come off. It doesn't start when you're like kissing each other. It starts at hello. It starts from that moment that you meet the person for the first time or you're going on your fourth date. Every single little red flag, every little bit of less than safe interaction that you have with that person is stealing away from your orgasm. Right. So the other piece that I'm going to just drop in here about fawning and why it's so detrimental in the context of toxic dating culture. When we fawn or when we experience any kind of shutdown type stress responses in bed, our bodies cut off the connection to all of our organs below the diaphragm, which includes your genital system and your reproductive system. So not only are these stress responses and toxic dating culture, which is preventing us from feeling fully safe and awake in, our casual or even short-term dating experiences. Not only is it impacting our fertility and our reproductive health, it's literally cutting us off from our own orgasm. So the more those stress responses are triggered, the less sensation we'll have, the less capable we'll be of having an orgasm when we want to. We've seen this sort of statistic of only 1 in 10 women have orgasms with their casual partners. And the response from many people has been that men need more clitoracy. They need more education into how female genitalia works and female pleasure works. And while that is true, the one piece that isn't being looked at is how safe did those women feel during their casual encounters? And a separate study found that men care more about their female partners, about the pleasure of their female partners when they're in long-term relationships. They care less when they're having sex with someone they're never going to see again. So that disparity right there kind of puts it in black and white in terms of where some of the issues lie and how we really need to, again, like bring in compassion, whether you're never going to see them again or whether you're going to wake up next to them every morning.
Well, this has been an exceptionally enlightening conversation. I'm so glad that we got connected and that we get to share this conversation with our audience because and it's interesting that you say that, because I think that from everything that we've talked about, if you're listening to this podcast, it gives you some information to really understand, well, what are the kind of situations that I do feel safe in? If I haven't felt safe in the past, how do I get myself to be safe, or how do I become safe? Or do I want to be in that situation anyway? Or do I maybe not want to be in that situation? And again, giving you some information on figuring out what it is that you want. What is pleasure for you, and how do you want to navigate through this so that you're really taking your own power back, which is fantastic. So Nischa's book is called Fawn. And Nischa, it's, in wherever you buy books, I'm assuming right now.
Well, it's when is this coming out, this episode?
I'm not sure. When's the book coming out?
Well, it's end of February, early March. So it's coming very, very soon from the time that we've recorded this.
Yes.
The e-reader version is on my website if people want to grab the e-version. Mm-hmm. And my website is nischaphair.com. People can find me at my Instagram or reach out for a consultation if they're interested in learning more about pleasure work.
Yeah. And thank you for the work that you're doing. And thank you for all the women that you'll be working with so that they can actually, discover their own pleasure.
Love it.
Thanks for your time, darling.
Thank you.